This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. ASEAN leaders sign a declaration in Malaysia on the region's future amid rising global uncertainty. The bloc strategy to build diverse economic ties is in focus as Chinese Premier Li Qiang arrives for key talks. French President Macron kicks off his Southeast Asian tour in Vietnam with dozens of deals signed, including the sale of 20 Airbus planes, as well as defense and space pacts. North Korea intensifies the investigation into the capsizing of a brand new warship, detaining officials involved in the mishap. And shares in Nippon Steel surged in Tokyo after U.S. President Donald Trump signaled approval of the Japanese firm's proposed takeover of U.S. steel in what's seen as a U-turn. Also ahead on East Asia Tonight, a week to go before South Korea elects its new leader, and the three-way race is getting tighter. And by some measures, China is the most influential country in Southeast Asia. Its Belt and Road Initiative has infused billions of dollars into boosting regional infrastructure and more. But why are perceptions of the superpower divided? Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim says that ASEAN members have agreed to boost regional trade and investment. The remarks come as the bloc faces challenges in light of Washington's tariffs, leading to trade uncertainties for the region's economies. Leaders have signed the Kuala Lumpur Declaration, a landmark move outlining the bloc's roadmap for the next 2 decades. And as ASEAN members watch closely what U.S. President Donald Trump will do after a 90-day pause of tariffs, Mr. Anwar says he had written a letter to Mr. Trump requesting a meeting to address those tariffs. The Malaysian Premier also hailed the bloc for taking significant steps to engage warring sides in Myanmar. He adds Malaysia will continue speaking separately to the military government and its armed opposition groups to try to encourage direct talks.
Quiet engagement matters, and this small and the breach may be fragile, but as they say, in matters of peace, even a fragile breach is better than a widening gulf. I strongly believe in the fortitude and staying power of ASEAN to withstand the headwinds and weather the storms of the challenges and uncertainties facing us.
Meanwhile, Chinese Premier Li Qiang has arrived in Kuala Lumpur a day after paying an official visit to Indonesia. Mr. Li will attend the inaugural ASEAN GCC summit tomorrow, involving major oil producers from Gulf states. He is expected to meet industry leaders and speak at the event. For more on this, we are joined now by CNA's Melissa Goh, live from Kuala Lumpur. Mel, I believe leaders, they've signed the Kuala Lumpur Declaration. What's the significance of this move?
Well, essentially, it's a roadmap or a blueprint laying the foundation for the Southeast Asian grouping for the next 20 years. Now, it comes as ASEAN marked its 10th anniversary of the formation of ASEAN community. I mean, it was here in Kuala Lumpur that the ASEAN vision was first launched. 97%, they said the key pillars have already been achieved under the Vision 2025. Now, there are 3 main pillars, namely political and security, economic community, and the social cultural aspects of it. Now, the Vision 2045, which was encapsulated in the Kuala Lumpur Declaration that's signed by all 10 ASEAN leaders just a while ago, has injected renewed optimism and confidence. Prime Minister Anwar, whom I spoke with earlier, said, as ASEAN chair, he said he's very happy with the development. In a way, the sweeping tariffs by the Trump administration has given a new impetus towards regional economic integration. Now, ASEAN countries, are slapped with some of the highest tariffs, ranging from 10 to 49%. Now, the ASEAN summit, as well as the ASEAN GCC summit with the Gulf nations tomorrow, plus one with China, the trilateral one, are important platforms, he said, for ASEAN to expand inter-regional trade, while further strengthen intra-ASEAN trade that remains low at 23%. Now, above all, the KL Declaration will also highlight on sustainable and inclusive growth, with the people of ASEAN at its heart. Now, to close the so-called development gap while strike a united front to maintain peace, stability and prosperity in the region. ASEAN is on track to become the fourth largest economy by year 2030 and connect all its national power grids to create an ASEAN power grid by 2045. Now, I spoke with the Malaysian Energy Minister, Fadila Yusof. He's also the country's Deputy Prime Minister. He said he's upbeat about the prospects for ASEAN as a whole. Let's take a listen.
So while this is the grid is connected, just imagine the potential of ASEAN as a power hub for the world. So we can collaborate in terms of the business perspective with enough energy where we can exchange between countries, then we can jointly grow the economic, and that's betterment for the social well-being of the ASEAN community. So the entire ASEAN is actually the energy hub for the world.
Now, the signing of the KL Declaration has just ended. Now, it's an exciting time ahead, despite the geopolitical, the geo-economic tensions and the fluid situation, because no one really knows, what's going to happen after the Trump tariffs 90 days pause is over. And many of the ASEAN countries have already started negotiating bilaterally with Washington, including Malaysia.
Now, Mel, we are also hearing that ASEAN members are in favor of Timor-Leste's bid to join the bloc. What else do you know about that?
Well, Timor-Leste is on track to be admitted as the 11th member of ASEAN, although it may not be this year, but certainly there is now greater push to do so. Now, yesterday, the Foreign Minister of Malaysia, who chaired the meeting, Muhammad Hassan, said all the ASEAN leaders agreed in principle to admit Timor-Leste. If it can fulfill most of it, all the 84 criteria, then admit first. Then while ASEAN will help, Timor-Leste will be given time to complete or fulfill the rest of the criteria within a given time frame. But it must work doubly hard. It must push itself. Now, its president, Nana Guzman, was here, and he said he was confident there's no problem to meet all the requirements. In fact, there's only 3 or 4 left. Now, all in 84 legal instruments.
Many thanks for that report. CNA's Melissa Goh, live from Kuala Lumpur. The Chinese premier says that China is looking at new policy tools in the face of an international trade order that is, quote, under severe impact. Now, Mr. Lee was speaking in Jakarta at a symposium of Chinese companies over the weekend. And according to Chinese state media, he said that Beijing is studying new policy tools, including some unconventional measures that could be launched as the situation changes. The Chinese leader wrapped up his Indonesia trip on Sunday. Trade and investment in focus at his meeting with President Prabowo Subianto. Two sides signed several agreements on maritime cooperation and tourism, among others. Well, Mr. Lee is in Jakarta just 1 month after Chinese President Xi Jinping's trip last month. Mr. Prabowo also visited Beijing in November.
我们两国元首就构建具有地区和全球影响力的中印尼命运共同体达成了重要共识，引领两国关系迈上历史上新高度。
Well, earlier, an analyst told us that ASEAN is likely to pursue a twin-track trade negotiation with Washington. While the bloc speaks in a unified voice on the levies, its member countries will also try to carve out bilateral trade deals with the Trump administration.
In terms of dealing with the U.S., they're basically pursuing a twin track. One is the bilateral negotiations with the Americans. The tariff level for ASEAN countries are actually not fixed in a single number. Every country will have a different tariff level. But on the other hand, they're trying to find a collective voice among ASEAN countries to come together for some sort of a common position for America. My understanding is that the ASEAN countries have more or less decided to do a wait-and-see attitude. The reason is because they know that Trump is very unpredictable. So, for example, he has postponed the starting date for the tariffs several times. So countries in ASEAN are actually sending their trade ministers to Washington, on the one hand, to discuss the issue bilaterally. Secondly, ASEAN collectively will probably take a wait-and-see attitude to see what Trump will actually do in the coming months. So, for example, Malaysia is not only looking at CTTP and RCEP, Malaysia is in the process of joining the BRICS as well. So the way to understand the approach is that Anwar, this is the first time he is the chair of ASEAN. So he's very actively promoting this idea of multilateral trade to joining as many international organizations as possible. And once Malaysian join this organization, it's going to try to bring these organizations to deal with ASEAN collectively. So we're really looking at, over the long term, some sort of ASEAN free trade area negotiating with many of these different blocs.
French President Emmanuel Macron has wrapped up his first day of talks in Vietnam following meetings with several leaders. Well, he's on a Southeast Asian tour to position France and Europe as reliable partners with no strings attached amid the US-China rivalry. Well, his visit comes a month after Chinese President Xi Jinping visited the region. France and Vietnam have signed 14 deals covering nuclear energy, railways, satellites, as well as vaccines. That's after a meeting between Mr. Macron and his Vietnamese counterpart, Long Kong. Now, an Airbus pact was also agreed upon, with Hanoi buying 20 aircraft for its low-cost airline Vietjet. The deal was closely watched in recent weeks as Hanoi signaled a shift to purchase some 200 planes from Boeing, following pressure from Washington to reduce its trade surplus. Both sides also reaffirmed their commitment to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, a sticky issue between China and Vietnam over its contested boundaries.
L'ordre international, celui-ci dans un moment à la fois de grand déséquilibre, mais des retours de discours de puissance ou d'intimidation, impose que nous agissions ensemble pour préserver un ordre fondé sur le droit, condition sine qua non à toute prospérité.
Well, this marks the first trip to Vietnam by a French president in nearly a decade. Vietnam is looking to strengthen multilateral partnerships to hedge against China. France, too, is seeking to counter Beijing's growing influence in the region. Southeast Asia has recently been in the spotlight for diplomatic pushes as home to export-reliant countries affected by trade measures from the US. Mr. Xi's visit to the region last month highlighted Beijing's show of support for the nations against Washington's tariffs. Following Vietnam, Mr. Macron is due to make a stop in Indonesia, with a stronger defense partnership high on the agenda. His final stop will be in Singapore, where he will deliver the opening speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, Asia's largest forum on security and defense. Earlier, we spoke with Emeritus Professor Carlisle Thayer from the University of New South Wales, Canberra, on what Emmanuel Macron hopes to achieve with this visit.
Well, he wants to demonstrate that France is an Indo-Pacific power. It not only has territories in the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific, but it has vital national interest in the security of the sea lanes of the South China Sea because of Europe's dependency on its trade with Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia itself. So he also wants to demonstrate that France is opposed to Chinese hegemony and U.S. bullying. But China, in the past, has had a nice, and almost France and China are on the same wavelength in terms of their rhetoric, that they both oppose bullying, they support international law. But China then adds the additional rider that you shouldn't take steps that harm China's interests. So I have to view France as adding a bit of competition to it, but China will be happy to see if there's daylight between France and the U.S., and there's differences there that China can exploit.
We're going for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Chinese food delivery giant Meituan turning in better than expected revenue despite the sluggish economy. And AI firm OpenAI, known best for its ChatGPT chatbot, is setting up its first office in South Korea. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia Tonight. Well, Roland Lim is standing by now with the very latest in the business news. Roland, I believe China's leading food delivery group, they're still doing better than expected. What do you have for us in that?
Yes, I'll tell you, despite the fierce domestic competition and a sluggish Chinese economy, we'll have a look at what their secret sauce for success is. First, Meituan has reported better than expected sales in the first quarter after a strong push into markets outside of mainland China. Adjusted net income for January to March rose 46% on year to $1.5 billion. Our total revenue hit 12.1 billion. That's about 18% higher. Meituan has intensified efforts to expand outside of mainland China over the past year amid domestic challenges. Now, it's been facing increased competition from other major players such as JD.com and Alibaba's Ele.me, which is Ele.me, in its core food delivery business. In addition, there is growing scrutiny from regulators. Authorities on Sunday issued draft guidelines over the fees online platforms charge merchants. Meituan previously revealed that it plans to spend $1 billion over the next 5 years to build its food delivery service in Brazil. It has recently expanded into Hong Kong and the Middle East. Meituan stock in Hong Kong closing 5.5% lower on Monday before the firm filed its earnings report card. Hopes of Nippon Steel's takeover of U.S. Steel going through, sending stocks, both companies up after U.S. President Trump broadly endorsed the $14.9 billion deal. Now, Nippon Steel pared gains to end the session 2.1% up after surging more than 7% in earlier trade. U.S. Steel shares soared 21% on Friday after the president's remark. Now, Wall Street is closed today for Memorial Day. Analysts say the merger would create the world's third biggest steel producer by volume. However, the exact scope of the deal, well, that remains unclear.
So, an unexpected turn of events. President Trump, who initially opposed a foreign takeover of U.S. Steel, has now given his blessing to Nippon Steel's $15 billion bid for the company. This reversal has big implications. So I've got to bring you in here again, Roland. So help us understand this. Why has Trump suddenly changed his position and thrown his support behind the deal?
Well, essentially, the Nippon Steel deal actually aligns with Trump's goals. It is essentially a mix of political and economic opportunity for him. First off, jobs, that's a huge factor. This deal, this so-called planned partnership, will create some 70,000 jobs, and he's already planning a rally at U.S. Steel's Pittsburgh HQ to say as much that, and that's going to underscore his election prospects if he should ever run again. Remember, Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh, it's very much a swing state for the elections. Secondly, there's strategic diplomacy. Japan-U.S. trade talks going on right now. And this could be a bargaining chip to say that, look, I'm doing you a favor here by approving the Nippon Steel deal. What are you going to give me in return, says to Japan? And then lastly, of course, the way that Trump has framed this deal, he's calling it a planned partnership, which means that he is insisting that the U.S. will still maintain control of U.S. Steel. So he's pandering to his electoral base to say that he's not selling the crown jewels.
So I'm a bit confused by the fact that, Trump is very deliberately calling it a partnership rather than an outright acquisition. But what does that mean, though? I mean, does that mean that U.S. Steel isn't being fully sold off?
Well, that part is still murky. Even I don't have the answer to that.
You don't?
No, I don't. The White House isn't elaborating, and neither are both companies. All that U.S. Steel has issued a statement to say that despite the deal, the U.S. Steel will remain American. That's all U.S. Steel has said. Nippon Steel hasn't commented on the deal yet, so we don't have the full details, whether, as you say, whether this planned partnership is actually political phrasing or is it an actual partnership, economic-wise, it's 50-50. So that's still not clear.
Yeah, and I got to hear from Nippon Steel's perspective, though. I mean, this takeover bid has been far from easy from them, facing a lot of political pushback. So why is Nippon Steel still so committed?
Right, yes. I think for Nippon Steel, it is nothing short of a strategic necessity. I mean, the domestic steel market in Japan is saturated and on the decline. Now, with this one big deal that Nippon Steel is doing, it's going to catapult the company to the world's #3 steel maker from 63 million tons a year to 86. So it's going to become number 3 like overnight if the deal gets through. And then, of course, the costs are significant. We're talking about financing a $14-15 billion takeover deal. But Nippon Steel seems to be confident that it can do it. And of course, it's making a long-term bet on its future.
So, speaking of costs, we know that Nippon Steel had to sweeten the deal just to get Washington on board. So, what was the carrot? What was the carrot they've been hanging?
Well, the original deal, if you can imagine, was $1.4 billion to upgrade U.S. Steel's mills. And then they had to double it to $2.7 billion to sweeten that deal. But that wasn't enough. And eventually they quadrupled it to $14 billion in order to buy over the company and entice them as well with a $4 billion new state-of-the-art mill. So that's too much of an enticement, I think, for America, because that was actually real money to be invested in America over a 14-month period. And that's a win as far as Trump is concerned in terms of trying to bring back jobs to America.
All right, understood. Thanks very much for that, Roland.
Right. More news. OpenAI has set up a South Korean unit, which will open its first office in Seoul amid growing demand for its ChatGPT service. Now, this will be its third Asian branch after Tokyo and Singapore. Now, South Korea has the largest number of paying ChatGPT subscribers after the US. Earlier this year, OpenAI announced it would develop artificial intelligence products for South Korea with chat app operator Kakao. Chief Strategy Officer Jason Kwon is visiting Seoul and will reportedly meet with officials from the main opposition Democratic Party as well as the ruling People Power Party. Now, Mr. Kwon says OpenAI aims to work with South Korean policymakers, businesses, and developers to promote AI innovation tailored to local needs. NVIDIA will reportedly launch a new artificial intelligence chipset for China that's significantly cheaper than its recently restricted H20 model. The graphics processing unit, or GPU, will be part of NVIDIA's latest generation Blackwell AI processors. Now, it's expected to be priced between $6,500 and $8,000. That's well below the $10,000 to $12,000 for the H20. And that's because of its weaker specifications and simpler manufacturing requirements. This would be the third time that NVIDIA had to tailor a GPU for China after the US imposed restrictions on high-tech exports to the country. China remains a huge market for NVIDIA, accounting for 13% of its sales in the past financial year. And that's it for business.
Thank you so very much for that, Roland. Okay, time now for a short break, but coming up in East Asia tonight, it's just 1 week more before South Korea's presidential election day. How is it shaping up for the candidates? We'll be bringing you the updates. And China expanding its Southeast Asian footprint with its Belt and Road Initiative. But political tensions have stalled projects in some countries, like the Philippines. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Southeast Asian leaders sign a declaration on the region's future in uncertain times as Chinese Premier Li Qiang lands in Kuala Lumpur for talks. French President Emmanuel Macron has wrapped up day one of talks in Vietnam, signing deals ranging from nuclear energy to satellites. He's on a Southeast Asia tour to position France and Europe as reliable partners amid intensifying US-China rivalry. And North Korea detains another official over last week's high-profile failed launch of a warship. Only 1 week remains before South Koreans head to the polls to elect their next president. The snap election has become increasingly competitive, with a Democratic Party candidate, Lee Jae-myung, losing ground in recent polls. A Real Meter survey released Saturday puts Lee's support at 46.6%, still leading but with a narrowing margin. Trailing him is People Power Party candidate Kim Un-soo, now polling at 37.6%, closing in on the front-runner. Lee Jun-suk of the minor New Reform Party is also gaining momentum, breaking into double-digit support for the second time since the start of the race. Well, attention is now on whether Kim and Lee Jun-suk will merge their bids ahead of early voting, which begins on Thursday. Meanwhile, the candidates have been outlining key policy pledges on the campaign trail. Lee Jae-myung vowed to pursue what he called pragmatic diplomacy, putting national interest above ideology. He also promised to strengthen ties with the US and Japan, a stance aimed at distancing himself from the pro-China image often associated with past Liberal administrations. Kim Un-soo, on the other hand, pledged to limit presidential immunity. He says this is aimed at balancing power structure between the party, government and presidential office. South Korea currently allows a single 5-year presidential term, but Kim has proposed shifting to a 2-term system, even offering to shorten his own term to 3 years if this goes through. Calls for constitutional reform have grown louder since former President Yoon Suk-yeol was ousted in December after imposing martial law. The event reignited the debate over the scope of presidential power in South Korea. North Korea, meantime, has reportedly detained another official over last week's failed launch of a warship. State media KCNA says Ri Hyung-sun, Vice Department Director of the Munitions Industry Department, was summoned and detained. It added that he's, quote, greatly responsible for the occurrence of the serious accident. He's the 4th person detained in connection with the accident. 3 others were summoned over the weekend, including the chief engineer at the shipyard. Pyongyang opened a full-scale investigation after the 5,000-ton vessel was crippled during a launch ceremony on Wednesday. The warship is said to be under repair after the damage from its attempted launch. Well, satellite imagery showed the vessel lying on its side with most of its hull submerged and draped by a blue top. A North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, who was present at the failed launch, blamed military officials, scientists and shipyard operators, labeling the fiasco a criminal act. He wants the warship repaired before the plenary session of the ruling Workers' Party next month, calling it a matter of national honour. China's ambassador to Australia has criticised Canberra's intention to return Darwin Port to local ownership. Ambassador Xiao Qian said the Landbridge Group, the Chinese company running the port, had contributed to the local economy and that the project deserves encouragement, not punishment. He added that trying to reclaim the port once it becomes profitable is ethically questionable. The Australian government says the port is vital to the region's economy, but also a critical infrastructure asset of national importance. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had said during his election campaign in April that his government wants the port to be in Australian hands and would directly intervene and buy the port if it's unable to find a private buyer. But before that move becomes official, it's business as usual, according to a non-executive director at Landbridge. Well, the trade disruption stemming from U.S. President Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariffs is pushing cash-strapped Hong Kong SMEs into survivor mode. While the 90-day trade truce between the U.S. and China signals easing trade tensions, Hong Kong SMEs are watching the tariff pause with caution. Mei Wong reports from Hong Kong.
These aluminum facade panels may be the only thing left shining in Danny Lau's business for now. His 65-year-old company supplies exterior wall panel products to commercial buildings in Hong Kong, China, and the U.S. The American market accounts for 1/3 of this company's revenue. But orders have stopped since April, when President Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs, under which Mr. Lau's aluminum products would face almost 80% of tariffs.
U.S. market is big market, and they can pay higher price. They're looking for some quality products. Sometimes they need it fast. They don't mind paying higher price. So this market is difficult to be replaced as far as we are concerned. And we try to open up like Middle East market, but population-wise is much lower than the U.S.
Mr. Lau is also the honorary chairman of the city's SME Association, says survival remains shaky for members with the temporary trade truce between the U.S. and China.
If the talks break down, then a lot of manufacturers, they are suffering, and they can't afford to be survived because they have some finished products holding and nobody interested to buy. Then their cash flow will be in trouble. They have to pay their suppliers, but they don't have any income. So that makes them hard to survive.
Hong Kong SMEs have already lost precious time over the first 5 months of this year, with many not receiving any new orders from their US clients because of the trade war. Now, during this current tariff truce, many of them are actually racing against time to export the current stockpile of products to the United States. But with no new orders coming in from the US, well, many of the SMEs continue to face mounting losses, and many of them still remain extremely nervous about the road ahead. Many local SMEs used to rely on the mainland as an affordable production base. That may no longer be feasible.
Because of the global supply chain fragmentation, if it wants to target the rest of the world as the alternative market, it will need to start thinking about production elsewhere beyond mainland China, given the tariff escalation, which may not only be limited to the US in the future. And lastly, if the door of the US is shut, then obviously finding other market will be very essential.
While relocating production will likely take longer to materialize, Hong Kong's SMEs are facing another pressing issue.
In the whole April and early May, no shipments to US from China. So all the shipping companies, they stopped, and then now everyone asking for space to ship to US. So I don't think they have sufficient space, sufficient ship to serve this critical moment. And also, don't forget the price of the shipment will be high too. The demand and supply is not even.
A 2024 survey showed over 3/4 of Hong Kong SMEs had not yet recovered to pre-pandemic levels. The tariff war will likely make the path to recovery even more uncertain. May Wong, CNA, Hong Kong.
In recent surveys, China has been found to be the most influential power in Southeast Asia, both politically and economically. But perceptions of the country remain divided. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has promised to pour billions of dollars into projects across the region. Now, in the first of a series on China's growing influence, CNA explores the impact of this infrastructure drive.
53-year-old Hanani Katahum has been visiting this construction site regularly over the past few years to check on the progress of the terrace house allocated to his family. In 2018, some 20 families on the southern Philippine island of Mindanao were asked to relocate as part of the government's plans to build a China-funded railway. Then, farmers stopped work in preparation for the move, and residents were promised compensation for their land. 7 years later, the construction on the railway has yet to start due to tensions between China and the Philippines.
Malaking epekto yun kasi yung karamihan sa amin dito mahirap lang po eh. Naalaga ng mga hayop, ganyan. Tapos na-stop yun. Sa daily list ng mga tao dito, talagang nahinto yun. Tapos nahirapan. Yung iba umutang na nga eh kasi umasa na bayaran sila.
Many major Belt and Road projects in the Philippines have been abandoned due to territorial disputes between Manila and Beijing in the South China Sea. The Philippines is one of several Southeast Asian countries that have struck deals with China to develop infrastructure over the past decade. These projects are funded by low-interest loans under the Belt and Road Initiative. which has surpassed $1 trillion in engagement. But opinions of the deals are divided. Some say countries can use advanced Chinese technology to get things done faster. Others argue the initiative can trap poorer nations into debt when projects are scaled back or even abandoned. Former Supreme Court Justice Antonio Carpeo, who represented the Philippines in maritime negotiations with China, feels that Beijing was dangling loans for leverage on territorial disputes.
Well, I don't think China really intended to give us the loans, because even during the time of President Duterte, they never gave us the loans. I mean, they dangled all of these loans to Duterte, $24 billion, in exchange for Duterte being very soft on China on the South China Sea.
But China has maintained that the Belt and Road Initiative is not about debt trap diplomacy. President Xi Jinping has said the Belt and Road Initiative aims to build a road of peace, prosperity, openness, green development, and innovation, and a road that brings together different civilizations. Still, the Philippines is looking for other sources to fund its infrastructure projects.
The Philippine government is now talking with the United States, talking with Japan, talking with European countries, and other like-minded states, okay, and mostly Western states. But they're also taking them too slow to implement because of some procedural concerns. I don't think Marcos Jr. will be able to accomplish any major infrastructure projects under his administration because his term is ending in 2028.
Despite the territorial disputes, some Filipinos are keen for the government to return to the negotiating table with China and break the current stalemate. Amir Yusof, CNA, Mindanao, Philippines.
For more on the impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia, head over to our website, cna.asia. Time now for another break, but coming up next, Ukraine says it intercepted more than 80% of the drones and missiles Russia launched overnight in Moscow's largest drone attack in the war so far. And China's Guizhou province set to receive more rainfall days after being hit by deadly landslides. U.S. President Donald Trump has launched a furious barrage of criticism against Vladimir Putin. He says he is not happy with the Russian leader, calling him absolutely crazy for attacks on Ukraine. Now, his angry post came after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed America's silence was encouraging Moscow to prolong the war. Mr. Trump warned that any bid to conquer all of Ukraine will be Russia's downfall. Now, he also threatened tougher sanctions after Moscow's biggest air attack on Ukraine killed at least a dozen people.
I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all.
Russia's biggest air attack yet on Ukraine saw more than 360 Russian drones and missiles sent towards cities overnight, including the capital, Kyiv. The country says more than 230 drones, as well as all 9 missiles, were shot down, while 55 drones were redirected through signal jamming. Well, that leaves some 60 drones possibly reaching their intended targets. The Interior Minister condemned the attacks as a ruthless strike aimed at civilians. Mr. Zelensky, reacting to the strikes, said Russia was acting out of a sense of total impunity as he called for greater sanctions against Moscow. Russia reported Ukraine firing back with drones as news emerged that President Putin's helicopter was caught in the middle of an attack last week. State news agency TASS says the aircraft was at the epicenter of a Ukrainian drone attack during Mr. Putin's visit to Kursk, and the assault was repelled. It did not say exactly if the Russian leader was on board. Russia's offensive could escalate dramatically. Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, posted this map, warning that a planned security buffer zone could cover nearly all of Ukraine if military aid continued to be given to Kyiv. Earlier, CNA spoke to Aurel Braun, a professor of international relations at the University of Toronto, and he began by telling us if we can expect a shift in President Trump's stance on Russia.
It is the hope of many allies of the United States that this indeed would be a shift, that in a sense Mr. Trump would be mugged by reality, that he would come to understand that Vladimir Putin, in fact, has been playing him all along, that Vladimir Putin is not interested in real settlement. But if you look at the language, and I think you were entirely correct when you said this was almost as if speaking about a friend. I am not happy. Contrast that with the language that he used in terms of allies in Western Europe, or the brutal put-down that Mr. Trump engaged in the Oval Office in February when Mr. Zelensky, the democratically elected president of Ukraine, was visiting. So I think the hope is not policy. And we have not seen a change in Mr. Trump's policies towards Russia, not so far. This is not to say that it may not come in the future, but for the moment, he seems to be driven by at least two major goals, Mr. Trump. One is that somehow in negotiations, he could persuade Vladimir Putin to switch away from China, switch alliances towards the United States. The United States would then concentrate on China. And second, Mr. Trump, as a mercantile, transactional president, also has talked repeatedly about these phenomenal opportunities for trade and investments in Russia. I'm afraid that both of these are fantasies, and they are not going to come about.
Okay, but Mr. Trump did say that he would absolutely consider imposing additional sanctions on Russia, although he's been warning Putin since March, but so far we haven't seen an action. It hasn't followed his words. Professor, if he does indeed slap sanctions on Russia, will it likely to alter Putin's calculations?
In a sense, when we look at Vladimir Putin, it's a glass half full and a glass half empty. It is half full because he seems to, at one level, project a confidence that he can win in Ukraine, and this is why he's not negotiating seriously, except demanding what essentially amount to terms of surrender from Ukraine. On the other hand, one could look at it in a different way and say that this is also an act of desperation. He seems to want to knock Ukraine out before major sanctions could be leveled at him, before the Europeans begin the massive rearmaments that they're committed to, before Mr. Trump switches his approach and begins to impose serious sanctions. And yes, if the United States were to join the Europeans, who now have said that they are going to up sanctions, and they have already moved to, in some limited but not insignificant ways, to increase sanctions, for example, against the shadow fleet, something like 200 of the 800 ships that Russia uses to move oil and break sanctions. That could be very powerful because Europeans cannot do it alone. The United States has to be engaged in using secondary sanctions against those countries that violate the first sanctions. So an American involvement would send a powerful message and would have also an immediate economic effect on the Russian economy that, in fact, is very weak. A Russian economy that is unidimensional, a Russian economy that is suffering high inflation, and a Russia that now is in the fourth year of a war, almost as long as the Second World War involvement of Russia, and they haven't won. And even though Ukraine is not winning, in Russia, almost 1 million people have already left, and Russian casualties add up to almost 1 million as well.
Well, I've got more coverage on the war in Ukraine on our website, cna.asia, and on our mobile app, including this commentary on what to make of the restart in ceasefire negotiations between the two warring sides. Chinese authorities are warning of severe storms and what could be the country's heaviest rainfall this year. The National Observatory says heavy rain will lash Guizhou as well as the country's southern regions from Tuesday to Thursday, and warning of heightened risks to areas already hit by downpours. Last week, landslides struck Guizhou and neighboring Guangxi provinces. Authorities on Sunday are still in search and rescue mode, trying to get to people believed to be trapped at one Guizhou county, with persistent rain hampering operations. 4 people have died. Officials said they will not stop searching for the missing. In other news, Japan wants to slash rice prices to around half their current levels as it faces down a consumer backlash over food inflation. The Farm Ministry says it will release stocks to selected retailers at the reduced price of around 2,000 yen or $14 per 5 kilograms, and that will help to speed up getting the cut price grain onto supermarket shelves. This comes as a Kyodo News survey over the weekend shows the majority, 60% of Japanese people, believe their new farm minister, Shinjiro Koizumi, could bring down sky-high grain prices. Mr. Koizumi was appointed after his predecessor resigned over remarks that he never had to buy rice. Japan has been releasing rice from its stockpiles since March, but that has done little to contain prices and replenish the shelves. Mr. Koizumi last week said the government will change its tactic by selling the grain directly to retailers and bypassing auctions. Now, I've got some headlines for you from media outlets in East Asia. Researchers are warning of a surge in incurable chronic gut conditions in Hong Kong. The South China Morning Post report says that's due to diets high in fat and sugar linked to economic development. Meantime, Yonhap News reporting that rock carvings found in Ulsan City of humans, animals, ships and tools could likely win UNESCO World Heritage recognition. The engravings, known as petroglyphs, are believed to be made thousands of years ago. A Yomiuri Shimbun poll shows about half of respondents would like the Olympics and Paralympics to be held again in Japan in the future. It's a rate similar to a survey last year. At the same time, more than 90% also believe online slander against athletes, teams and their organizations remains a serious problem. A look at Japan's world of sumo wrestling before we go. A 24-year-old Ono Sato will be promoted to the top rank of Yokozuna to become one of only 2 top-tiered wrestlers in the sport. Well, he won the May tournament with a clear lead, securing a 14-win, 1-loss record. Ono Sato, with the latest trophy lift, has clinched a total of 4 championships since he debuted on the professional scene just 2 years ago. And he will be the first Japan-born wrestler to reach the top since 2017, while crushing the record for the fastest Yokozuna promotion in the sport. In sumo terms, that's as impressive as it gets. The Yokozuna promotion will be formalized when sumo officials hold a special board meeting on Wednesday. Ono Sato's high school coach saw his potential years ago, saying he had the potential to become, quote, the monster of the new era. And I hope you've enjoyed today's Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Your headlines, you can find it anytime at cna.asia, and you can also always look us up on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.